This is where it all began. A small dam, a mill pond, and a young man named Stephen Osmer, who in 1679 was sent here by his father Thomas, a wealthy Hartford merchant and landowner, to build for himself at this site a house and a sawmill. I am Nelson Burr, and I am here to tell you about the history of West Hartford. The phrase, "Go west, young man," is probably older than we think. And when young Stephen Osmer in 1679 hitched up his wagon for the long 4-mile trip to West Hartford, he could little have dreamed that the community that he was founding would someday grow into a town of over 70,000 souls. This is where it all began.
The origin of West Hartford really was in the founding of the city of Hartford in the years 1635 and 1636. You will recall that a group of English Puritan settlers, led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, came through the woods of New England to found a settlement in the Connecticut Valley in 1636. This group may be regarded as the pioneers of Hartford. When they reached the site of Hartford, they founded a village, which at first was called Newtown. The name was later changed to Hartford, in memory of the town in England, which was the birthplace of the Reverend Mr. Samuel Stone, who was Hooker's assistant. Years rolled on, and Hartford steadily grew. There was plenty of room for growth, because the original town of Hartford was huge. It included all of what is now the city of Hartford, West Hartford, East Hartford, and Manchester. It was about 14 miles long from east to west and 6 miles from north to south, and was bounded by the original towns of Windsor on the north, Wethersfield on the south, and Farmington on the west. The original western boundary was what is now Mountain Road in West Hartford. By the 1670s, the population had reached the point where it was decided that the undivided land in the western part of the town should be divided to landowners. So, in 1671, there was drawn up this list of owners of the undivided lands in West Hartford. In this list are the names of many men who became landowners in West Hartford. This map shows the division of the West Hartford land that began in the year 1672. All the area which is colored pink, from what is now Quaker Lane to Mountain Road, and extending all the way from the present Bloomfield to New Britain Avenue, was divided into more than 70 shares, known as the long lots. They were 1.5 miles long, and some of them were only a few rods wide. This was just a convenient way of making the division. Later, there was a lot of boundary juggling to get the land into convenient shapes. The brown area to the left, which borders Newington, is now Elmwood. The land east of Quaker Lane, as far as Prospect Avenue, was to be common land for grazing. The two areas at the top of the map, one at the left colored violet, and the other at the right, much larger and colored green, were later added to Hartford. And when West Hartford became a town, they became part of West Hartford. The large green area, which includes the present Reservoir Park, was taken from the town of Farmington in 1830 because the people there felt that they had more in common with West Hartford than they did with Farmington. The small violet area south of it is the area now called Selden Hill. This was taken away from Farmington in 1859 and was added to West Hartford because the people of Selden Hill felt that they had more in common, religiously and otherwise, with West Hartford than they did with Farmington. And all these areas together make up what is now the present extent of the town of West Hartford. When Stephen Osmer came here in 1679, he settled on the north side of Trout Brook, just west of North Main Street.
Now, Stephen Osmer did not live at this place for most of his life, but he did establish here a mill site which was active for a great many years. For many years in the 19th century, that is to say in the 1800s, there was a mill site at this place on the north bank of Trout Brook, and for many years it was run by a man named Charles Goodman, who had a house here in the neighborhood. The grist mill was the scene of a great deal of social and economic activity in early West Hartford. To this place, the farmers brought their wheat and their corn to be ground. And while they were here, of course, they talked with the miller, they gossiped, they passed the time of day, they talked about their family affairs and politics. Many years ago, some people living in a house on North Main Street near the mill site found in their front yard one of the old round millstones that used to go round and round in the mill, grinding the farmer's corn. And now here I am standing on that very millstone, which is now the doorstep of the house at 175 North Main Street. And so this is a proof that history is still with us. By the early 1700s, many settlers had come out here from Hartford to live. They were tradesmen, farmers, and young families bent on establishing themselves in the West Division, as West Hartford was then known. They built their farmhouses along the line of Main Street, between the present towns of Newington and Bloomfield. The street was laid out, as they used to say, in 1684, and the houses were strung out along that line. Well, now the people out here were not entirely happy because they still had to go to church way down in the village of Hartford. By 1710, there were two churches on Main Street in Hartford. The first, which is now the Center Church at the corner of Main and Gold Street, and the South Church at Buckingham Street. In 1670, the parish had split, and a second church was founded.
In October 1710, 28 people in the West Division sent to the Colonial Assembly the petition which is pictured here. The document is in the collections of the Connecticut State Library. In it, the people set forth their reasons for wanting to be a separate parish in the town of Hartford.
I can't leave the children alone to travel so far on the Sabbath, and it's too long a journey for the baby.
In bad weather, the horse don't like to haul the wagon all that way.
It's inconvenient.
I ain't as young as I used to be. My bones can't take all the Johnson every Sabbath.
One suspects that the real reason was that they wanted to manage their own local affairs in accordance with the New England spirit of local liberty. Anyway, the petition was referred to a committee, which in May 1711 reported in favor of letting the people in the West Division have their own parish. In May 1711, West Hartford for the first time attained a certain amount of self-government. If you look here, you will see that it became a parish with definite bounds. On the west by Farmington, on the north by the western part of Windsor, which is now Bloomfield, on the south by the western part of Wethersfield, which is now Newington, and on the east by about the line of Quaker Lane. Later on, the parish line on the east was extended to Prospect Avenue.
This map shows the colonial parishes of Hartford. The pink area in the center is now the city of Hartford, which by 1670 had two parishes, the first and the second. The yellow area east of the Connecticut River is now East Hartford. The parish there was established in the 1690s. Over at the left you can see the area of West Hartford. Far over to the right is an area which is now Manchester. That became a parish in the 1770s and was called Orford. The syllable or was taken from Windsor, and Ford was taken from Hartford. It was quite common in those days to name a parish by taking syllables from the names of the towns from which it was made up.
After they became a parish in 1711, one of the first things the people of West Hartford had to do was to organize a church. They did that in 1713. The date you see here on this metal plaque, north of the present meeting house of the church and on the east side of the green. The original church had 29 members when it was organized in 1713. There were 17 men and 12 women. They had names like Stanley, Merrill, and Webster, and some of the names on the list are still with us in West Hartford. Now you may wonder why, when the church was founded, there were only 29 members. The explanation for that is that in the Puritan churches of old New England, the membership was a selected few. That is, the membership was made up of people who could confess that they had had an experience of conversion, that they had accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, and that they had confidence in Him. In other words, they were twice-born people. Later on, of course, there might be a revival of interest in religion, and many more people would be added to the membership of the church.
Another thing that they had to do was build themselves a meeting house. The early New England meeting houses generally looked like this: small, square buildings with seats around three sides and the pulpit on the fourth side. Sometimes there was a ventilator in the center of the roof, and sometimes there might be a little belfry with the bell rope hanging down in the center of the congregation. By the 1740s, the meeting house had become too small. West Hartford had steadily grown in population, and it was felt that there should be a meeting house built in the new style of New England meeting house architecture. In 1741, the parish voted to build the second meeting house, which probably looked like this.
It stood right here at the northwest corner of Farmington Avenue and North Main Street, where the little green park is today. This is a model of that second meeting house in West Hartford, built in 1741 and 1742. The model was made by Mr. Gordon Bennett of West Hartford. According to official directions, the meeting house was 55 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a tower, a spire, and galleries. Those old meeting houses always had a broad front entrance, a double door, and after you entered the door, you walked directly towards the pulpit. My friends of West Hartford, I am seated in a slip in the meeting house of the First Church of Christ Congregational in Farmington, Connecticut. Now, why am I seated here? It is because this meeting house, in its general construction, its arrangements, and its general appearance, resembles the second meeting house in West Hartford, which was built in 1741 to 1742 and was used until 1834. That is, it was being used during the period of the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783. And now let me rise and show you some of the features of this typical colonial meeting house in Farmington. It was designed and built under the auspices of a Farmington designer and builder named Judah Woodruff. Let me point out to you first the construction of the building. A wooden frame composed of large hewn beams and pegged together very much like the frames of the houses and barns that the colonial people built for themselves. You'll notice the windows in this meeting house. They are plain glass. They wanted the pure light of day to come into their house of worship. They didn't believe in stained glass. That to them was a relic of pagan aestheticism, and they would have no part in it. It was idolatrous. And now notice the pulpit here, which was the principal feature of a New England colonial meeting house. When the pastor was preaching, he was elevated 6 or 7 feet above the level of the meeting house. And this was to give dignity to preaching, which was the principal part of their worship. Because from this pulpit, the minister explained to the people the Word of God as recorded in the Holy Bible. And up here you can see a Bible on a little desk in the pulpit. Now down below is a plain table which was used for the celebration of the Holy Communion, which they called the Lord's Supper. You will notice it is not an altar. It is just a plain, honest-to-goodness table with legs. And now I would like to talk with you a little while about the seating arrangements in these colonial meeting houses. These seats that you see here are modern, and they're called slips. But in the old meeting houses, you would have to picture, right here, a little square room with seats around 3 sides and a door that could be closed for privacy. This would have been your family pew, and you would have paid so much for it per year. And of course, the pews that were near the pulpit would have been more expensive. Here you would bring your family on Sunday for worship, which might last for several hours. The sermon alone might last a couple of hours, while the parson turned over his hourglass and would go on to say, and now I come to my 5th point. And you must remember that one of these pews could actually be willed. You could leave it in your will to one of your family. And sometimes right here on the door would be a little plaque with your name on it indicating whose pew it was, so that no one else could use it. Now you must remember that in these colonial meeting houses, in the wintertime, there was no heat. They didn't begin using heat in meeting houses until the 1790s and the early 1800s, so that in winter you would come here and sit in your heavy clothing during the long service. You might bring with you a little square foot warmer with some coals in it from your fireplace to keep the chilblains off your feet. And remember that in summer there was no air conditioning. If it happened to be 95 outside, it was pretty nearly that temperature in the meeting house. Another thing I would like to call to your attention is this gallery around 3 sides. Most of the colonial meeting houses had galleries like this one. And up in the gallery, they would seat the young people, especially the boys, with, of course, a man to oversee them so that they didn't misbehave. And up there also would be seated the servants and sometimes black slaves, because in these New England country towns, there were quite often black slaves. Now, most colonial meeting houses built in the 1700s had at one end a tower and a spire, such as you see here. The usual way to build the spire was to leave one side of the tower open before installing any stairs or floors. The spire could be built out here on the ground and moved into the tower, or could be built inside. And when it was finished, it was hoisted up through the tower like an elevator and securely fastened. Now, if we can believe a sketch in one of the old books of records of the church in West Hartford, the spire of the second meeting house in which Nathan Perkins preached his patriotic sermon undoubtedly looked very much like this. Now, of course, every colonial congregational parish had to have a minister. And in 1713, the parish of West Hartford called its first parson the Reverend Benjamin Colton. And he served for 46 years until 1759. He was succeeded by the Reverend Nathaniel Hooker, who served from 1759 to 1770 and who died comparatively young. He was succeeded in 1772 by the Reverend Nathan Perkins, who remained minister for an astonishing length of time, 66 years, until 1838. This portrait of him now hangs in the parish house of the First Church of Christ in West Hartford Center. Perkins was widely known as a preacher and political leader, and during the period of the Revolution, he was a patriot spokesman for the parish of West Hartford. Just as the millstone reminds us of the economic foundation of our community, so these old gravestones in our ancient cemetery call to mind the religious foundations of the community. This is the tombstone of the Reverend Benjamin Colton, the first pastor of the church, who served from 1713 to 1759. This gravestone gives us something of the flavor of an old Puritan parish. The symbol at the top, a head with wings on each side, symbolizes briefly what they believed about life and death. Man, represented by the skull-shaped head, is mortal. That is, his physical part is mortal. Man dies. But his spirit is immortal, and that is symbolized by those uplifting wings. Now, the carving of these gravestones was a genuine folk art, and some of the men noted for carving gravestones were known all over New England. Articles have been written about them. Some of them were really very capable artists. This is the gravestone of the Reverend Nathaniel Hooker, the second pastor of the church, a brilliant preacher and author who served from 1759 to 1770. This is known as a tabletop tombstone, composed of a heavy slab of sandstone with an inscription and supported by 5 stout pillars. Gravestones like this were very common in old New England cemeteries, and if you go down to Wethersfield and wander around the ancient graveyard back of the meeting house, you will see many gravestones like this one. Now we have seen that West Hartford was founded as a devoutly religious community, and we should pause to reflect that in colonial Connecticut, the Congregational Church was the legally established official church. Every parish had the right to levy a tax, which could be collected like any other tax, to build the meeting house, to pay the minister's salary, and for any other purpose that seemed necessary. But in colonial Connecticut, many people began to resent the special privileges of the Congregational Church and clergy, and especially after 1740, this gave rise to a strong movement of religious dissent. Many people began joining the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Universalists, the Sandemanians, the Friends, and other religious denominations. And these dissenters began to bring strong political pressure to bear to abolish the special privileges of the Congregational Church. Now, this movement culminated in 1818, when the state called a constitutional convention, which met in the old State House in Hartford, and wrote a constitution for Connecticut in which the special privileges of the Congregational Church and clergy were abolished. All religious denominations were put on the same legal footing so that they could be voluntarily supported. Now, the climate of religious liberty, which this Constitution engendered, gave rise to the founding of other churches in West Hartford.
A Quaker meeting was organized in the 1780s and 90s, and this meeting house now stands about where the old one was on South Quaker Lane. The Episcopalians built St. James's Church in the 1850s. The Baptists organized in 1858 and built this meeting house in 1859. The Universalist Church was established in Hartford in 1821 and built this church in West Hartford in 1930. The Irish immigration brought Roman Catholics, who built St. Bridget's Church in Elmwood in 1917 to 1918. And with other waves of immigration came other religions, the most recent of which are the Jews, who built Temple Beth Israel in the 1930s.
In the committee report of 1711, which recommended that West Hartford should become a parish, it is stated that the people wished to do so in order to look after liberty. Now, our town was founded by people who believed very strongly in the right of the church and the secular government to be founded upon the votes of the people. And when the British imperial government in the 1760s began to assert a right to tax and legislate for the 13 colonies, in all cases whatsoever, the people simply rose in revolt. New England exploded with rebellion, and the part that West Hartford took in the Revolutionary War is to be our next subject.